That's great. That's great. Okay, right. So we are on the theme of pilgrimage. And we spoke last week about that a pilgrim is someone who travels with sacred intent. A pilgrim is someone who travels with sacred intent, whether that be across the land, in our daily lives, or even just within our hearts. It's the traveling with sacred intent. And we spoke that it takes a decision to start on such a venture. You have to decide to go on that pilgrimage, one that assesses the terrain, and it involves the willingness to do whatever's necessary to reach the end point of that pilgrimage, whatever that might be. So there's a momentum that one needs to create. And that ultimately, all pilgrimage is a journey towards eternal truth. It's towards eternity. All pilgrimage is that. And that the reason that we start on pilgrimage is a desire to go deeper in our lives. Over a couple of weeks, I have asked who has been on a formal pilgrimage, whether the Camino or any such destination. And we heard from some people. Anybody here been on a formal pilgrimage? Do you want to put your hands up? Dee Dee, there we are. I just need to grab a microphone. I'm going to quickly come over just to find... No, we're just finding out what pilgrimage people have been on. So we've had... Mostly it's been the Camino. So what pilgrimage have you been on?
I was on the walk to Emmaus.
Emmaus!
Yes, and it was an outpouring of love. And at the end, they said, what was I going to promise Jesus I was going to do with my life? And I'm still trying to figure that out.
So this was the walk to Emmaus that Jesus made from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right. It was...
and the road to Emmaus where they said...
ritual of that.
That's right.
It was many years ago in Texas, I remember.
And what made you decide to do that?
I don't remember. I mean, yeah. I think it was a friend recommended it.
It wasn't.
And we had friends who had to write letters of support for us.
How old were you when you went?
I was just previous to a divorce, and it was probably early 90s. Maybe?
Early 90s, yeah. So you weren't a teenager or something like that?
No.
And did it leave you?
I was confused.
Did it have? Did it have an effect on you, the pilgrimage?
Yes, it did. I still have the cross with the colors that were knitted. Somebody knitted.
Yeah.
What do I want to call it? A lanyard or something that was on. I still have that, and I still have the little prayer book of the recipe for how you create a prayer. If somebody asks you in a meal, would you like to say grace?
Yeah.
And when I was little, I was told, I was asked, and they said, Dee Dee, can you say grace? And I said, I think so, grace.
Yes.
And
my son does, my daughter does that.
So, you know, it gave us a little bit. So I still remember that, how you start out with supplication on one thing or another. It did have an impact.
Thank
you.
It was
a great ritual.
Thank you, Dee Dee.
Sure.
I think it's always just good to hear from people who've been on these pilgrimages, so you get a sense of, what's happened over the last period of time. And I was chatting at the reception last week with someone, and they said, it's interesting, most pilgrimage destinations tend to be in Europe. And they said, well, that's probably because we're such a young country, but I'm sure that Native Americans actually did pilgrimage. Or people go to the Far East. I went on pilgrimage, actually, to Kyoto. When you get ordained in England, you have to go and do a placement somewhere. Normally they just go to Reading or somewhere, but I'd always bought my incense from Kyoto, and I always wanted to go to Kyoto. I said, I'd like to go to Kyoto for my placement, and I went to the Kyoto Anglican Church, and then visited all the temples in Kyoto. So people do tend to go. They go to Asia for pilgrimages. Can you think of anywhere on the American continent where people go to pilgrimages? Aspen, yeah, there we are. Thank you very much indeed, Aspen. I thought the Aztec, yes.
The missionary compound
Yes, that's one place. The Joshua Tree, I think people tend to go to on pilgrimage for. What were you going to say, Claire? Chimayo in New Mexico, yes. And so there are places where people do go on pilgrimages here, and I think it's developing over that period of time. And last week I actually asked you to look at how you might go on a pilgrimage towards Easter and to write it down. Those of you who weren't here last week, I've left, if you look at this, there's a wealth of this tree of paper on your seats, but as well as the speaker program thing, there is in there a little card that enables you to write your pilgrimage where you could do between. Does anyone want to share what they wrote down last week? No need to. Anyway, so it's an opportunity for you to decide to go on a pilgrimage over this next period of time and just follow it through. So once you've decided to start on your way, we've taken the first step, which is what last week was about, taking the first step. And the next stage after that is really to work out how you follow the path. How do you follow the path once you've decided to go on a pilgrimage? Obviously, if one's walking the Camino, there are signs that go this way. Camino this way. And so you tend to follow those, and there are maps that tell you where to go. Well, physically at least. But there are less maps to tell you what to do with your internal journey. Because when you go on pilgrimages, you follow the path, but really the pilgrimage is your internal journey. Externally, we just put one foot in front of the other. But internally, we're also asked to make that journey, which is the journey of letting go of the comforts of home. We're asked to reevaluate our relationship with our fellow pilgrims, to reevaluate our relationship with our mind, with the universe and our hearts. And whatever pilgrimage you go on, you're asked to reevaluate. It is a process of reevaluation. And we are asked to navigate a new way of being that actually supports the journey to the eternal. Pilgrimage is about discovering a new way of being on the journey towards the eternal. And if we're thinking of embarking on a pilgrimage, that's more home-based, one that doesn't involve going to a fixed geographical destination, maybe the ones that some of you wrote down, the discovery of an internal path that we're following is even more important. Last week, Heather read a poem about that. I'm going to ask her to reread it now.
So the poem's by William Stafford. The Way It Is. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread. But it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread.
So there's that idea of a thread that we follow. And that thread is really the thread that we follow through our lives. Diane Godfrey asked me last week what my pilgrimage was. And really, I said, I think she was disappointed with this answer. I said that I really see that my whole life is a pilgrimage towards the eternal, towards death. And I do view that, my life as a pilgrimage towards that death. And so, to that end, I do my daily practice, which involves meditation, readings, soul-searching, opening to the wisdom of the cosmic Christ. And that's my attempt to stay in touch with the thread that guides me along the path. I use my daily meditation to do that. And it serves both my overall path and also the path of any little particular pilgrimages that I'm on. And I seem to be going on many pilgrimages throughout my life. I've got the pilgrimage of supporting my kids through college. I've got of guiding the chapel towards, it's the pilgrimage of guiding the chapel towards a more authentic relationship with the divine. Of having speakers come and be heard by a wide variety of people. These are all little pilgrimage. Developing the Thursday Satsang community. All those are little pilgrimages where I'm moving along. I've got a task. I've got something I've got to undertake. And all these journeys are guided by the same thread that takes me on my path. Even writing this message, that's a little pilgrimage. I want to touch the eternal. I use my daily meditation to try and find my path to do that. And it's often said, that it's a bit like, that whole thing of spiritual practice is a bit like, I always think it's a bit like sailing. People go out, they're sailing they're on a sailing boat and they're sitting at the rudder and they say, I'm not getting anywhere. And often in our spiritual, when we're in our spiritual lives, we go along with them. Well, I'm not actually getting anywhere in my spiritual lives. And you want to say to the person who's in the sailing ship, who's holding the rudder and not getting anywhere, if you want to get somewhere, you've got to put the sails up. So you've got to put the sails up so the wind can catch. Oh, right. So you put the sail and they start moving. And it's the same in your spiritual life. If you haven't got a spiritual practice, then you've got nothing that will help you move forward. The spiritual practice doesn't have to be meditation. It could be walking the mountains. Anything that you decide is a spiritual practice. Can be washing up, gardening, singing. Anything can be a spiritual practice. But you really have to have that. You've got to do that. You have to have your sails up in order to be able to move along. And then you have to trim the sails. You have to navigate the sea. You have to have the hand on the rudder. But the power comes from the wind. The power of our spirituality comes from our contact with the divine. That's where it comes from. And once we find it, we can stick with it and it'll lead us to wherever life wants to bring us. And I think that thread, it's not so much an occupation or a way of doing things. It is more a way of being. That trimming of the sails, that once we get the right balance, it'll take us on our journey through life. That's how you follow the thread. And balance is the key thing. A couple of weeks ago, I quoted T.S. Eliot, and he had that concept of the still point in the turning world. When you're at that still point, that's the place where the wind can catch you. And he goes on to describe what it is like when you reach that still point. He says, the inner freedom from practical desire. The release, this is what he says it's like when you reach the still point. This is Eliot. The inner freedom from practical desire. The release from action and suffering. The release from inner and outer compulsion. We all know about that. The release from inner and outer compulsion. Yet surrounded by a sense of grace. A white light still and moving. Erebang, which means elevated. Erebang without motion. Concentration without elimination. Both a new world and an old made explicit. Understood in the contemplation of its partial ecstasy. The resolution of its partial horror. Yet the enchainment of the past and the future. Woven in the weakness of our changing body. Protects mankind from heaven and damnation, which flesh cannot endure. I like that. Woven in the weakness of the changing body, that moment protects mankind from heaven and damnation, which flesh cannot endure. There's the idea of the thread to follow. And I think we have to find that balance point, that still point in our lives. And when we find it, trimming the sails, we have to keep the balance. And that's the finding of the thread. And I think it does involve an aspect of doing, in that sometimes what we do as well has a bearing on our balance. What we do in life has a bearing on our balance. If we have a great skill in music, it's probably not good for Gwen to become a construction worker. Right. That might not be the best place for her. So you've got to really sense what's good for you to do. So in discovering that balance, we have to be aware of all the winds and the weather affecting us. We have to really become aware of everything that's around us. It's about that awareness, what our talents are, how our friends and family affect us, the nature of our environment, our position in the world. And like sailing, we have to take it all into consideration and then trim our sails accordingly to find that sweet spot, that still point in the turning world, because there is the thread. If we find that still point. And I think that requires a bit of self-consciousness, of being aware of ourselves in relationship to everything else and finding the balance that leads us to what I like to call the golden thread that weaves through our lives. I think that still point, it's a golden thread. And it's golden because there is an aspect of alchemy in the process. We are taking the base metal of our lives and we're turning it into gold. The transforming of our minds and the creation of something wonderful and whole. Because like a string on a violin that's in tune, when we follow the golden thread, that in itself becomes a transforming influence on all around us. You know, Gwen's voice has a transforming influence on those around. I don't know if any of you have read Richard Bach's book, Illusions. Have you read Richard Bach's book, Illusions? Recommend it. Anyway, Illusions is called Confessions of a Reluctant Messiah. It's very small, and it's really about someone who's found the golden thread. And magically, everything around him works because he's found that golden thread. It's almost as if our contribution in life is really to find that thread and stay with it. Because it's the thread that leads us, and we ourselves have to get out of the way. It's when we think that we know what the way is that we get into trouble, when our minds take over. The trick is to find the sweet spot in our lives and let that take us home. We let it take us home. The universe is calling to us, and we let it take us home wherever that leads us. I think it's, reminiscent of Theseus finding his way out of the Minotaur's labyrinth. He lets the thread out, and then he found his way back through the maze by following the thread. And in our lives, we find that way home by following the thread that is laid for us. And the context of pilgrimage is something that we can use. That's the purpose of pilgrimage. It's to use pilgrimage to find the thread that will lead us home. And home, ultimately, is the eternal. That's where we're going. That's what we're looking for. And pilgrimage is a way of doing that. Because on pilgrimage, we throw out all our normal props. The things we rely on to get us through. We say, let's find a different way. Let's see if we can change our environment or change ourselves and find a different way to find that thread to help us through on our pilgrimage, because then we can use it in everyday life. It's when you come back, it's not the pilgrimage, it's what you find on the pilgrimage that you use when you come back. Our phrase that we always use here, our purpose here, is to learn how to live life more skillfully. And on pilgrimage, you learn how to live your life more skillfully. And I can remember my own life, that it took quite some time for me to find that thread in my own life. Right at the beginning, I came from a single-parent home. My father died when I was 2. So we were all over the place. I was a dysfunctional child, in many ways. And that adds to the difficulty. Like the prodigal son, I find myself going down quite a few blind alleys to find the thread. In work, I tried broadcasting, I tried advertising, both of which were attractive, but actually didn't really satisfy me. And then gradually I began to narrow it down. I didn't like the way religion looked. I mean, never was very attracted to me, but there was something there very early on that made me feel safe. I felt safe in a scripture group or singing in the choir. The first thing I found on the thread was the safety. And then when you added spirituality, I started to begin to feel in the ballpark. But it's not really the activity. Even having become involved in all the spirituality and religion, I was still dysfunctional in my life. I was, doing stuff that was, not functional behavior, even while I'd gone on the spiritual path. And it wasn't really till I'd committed to a practice that I really began to find the thread, and my life began to change, and I became less dysfunctional. And if you speak to my children, they may say that I'm still dysfunctional. Because practice is really the practice. Practice is the practice of following the thread, following your breath, not letting your mind distract. All part of biblical going through the narrow gate. But, as I said, it's different for all of us. We all have different threads, our own unique relationship with the universe. And the key thing is to follow our thread rather than somebody else's. As Heather was talking about last week, use your teachers, but do not rely on them. Use your teachers, but do not rely on them too much. That's why you can get into trouble if you simply do what others tell you. You follow the thread, but it's not your thread. And that doesn't lead to transformation. It ends up leading to slavery when you follow somebody else's thread. I don't follow the rules. Even in my own practice, it's not about following the rules, somebody else's rules. I don't meditate every day. I like to have days off. So I only meditate Sunday to Thursdays. And I take Friday and Saturday off to watch Homeland or whatever it is on television. Instead of, I'm not meditating today, I watched The Bishop's Wife over the weekend. Great 1954 movie. But that sort of stuff, I don't meditate twice a day, which they say you should. I find once works for me. And it's about finding your own sweet spot or still point in that turning word. But really, finding that golden thread is the only game in town. There isn't another game in town. That is really what we're supposed to be doing. Everything else is just going through life unconsciously. What we talked about, that idea of dogging along. A dog just goes, you just go to the next bit of food or whatever it is, dogging along. You can be wonderfully successful, but if you're not on the thread, it's just so much water under the bridge, it will make no difference. But find the thread, and even if you are a simple, humble wool spinner like Gandhi, you can transform the world. Find the thread, and even by spinning wool, you can transform the world, because you are on the path that is meant for you. You are doing what you're supposed to be doing rather than simply doing what pleases you. And all of that has consequences, both for you and for the people around you. You can imagine the effect it has when people who you're following the thread, people who are following the thread, find themselves and each other and start weaving their threads together. When two or more people who are following the thread come together. And it's at that point, when we come together and weave our golden threads together, that we begin to weave the kingdom of heaven. You begin to weave the kingdom of heaven. In fact, you could say that the second coming is that moment when all of us in the world find our threads and begin to weave together a seamless garment of interconnectedness. That's when everything comes together and expresses itself as one. But of course, we can't try to engineer that, because the moment you do that, you end up looking up from your thread and not following it and trying to work it all out. You're in your head, not in your thread. You need to be in your thread, not your head. That's a little slogan I've got there. Very reminiscent of Meister Eckhart's meditative state. Remember that wanting for nothing, knowing nothing, and willing nothing. Willing nothing, knowing nothing, and wanting nothing. That's Meister Eckhart. Go along wanting for nothing, willing nothing, and knowing nothing, just following the thread. And how do you recognize that you are following the thread? How do you recognize that you got it? Well, certainly not by the fact that everything goes right although I did like Richard Bach's book, Illusions, it is not by having everything go right, because that just doesn't happen. And what you're following there is your desired outcomes. That's not the thread. When you can what you can use to recognize the thread, the thing that you can use to recognize that you're following the thread is peace in your heart. That is what you get when you follow the thread. The fact that you can feel the rightness and understanding that creates peace. And that, of course, is the peace that passes all understanding that's mentioned in many churches in the blessing every week. That's how you know. Even if you're in a dreadful situation, you can feel peace in your heart because you're following the thread. May the peace of God that passes all understanding keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of his Son, Jesus Christ. And may the blessing of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with you now and forevermore. May you find your thread that will show you the path that you need to take. It's you now.
Wow, this is so amazing, don't you think? This whole subject is so cool. So we're just going to take a second and to consolidate, to pause, to look within. First of all, I was just so touched by Gwen's first song. That's what it's all about, this like fullness of heart, of gratitude to the one who brought us into being, who gave us our lives, who put us on these pilgrimages in the first place. And this is all our response. This is all our response to that, in love, to love. And it just made me think of that simple prayer. God, may we know you more nearly, love you more dearly, and see you more clearly day by day. So just a few reflections and questions just to pick up on some of what we've just heard. First of all, just to ask yourself how much you're resonating with this whole thing of pilgrimage. How much do you feel you're on a pilgrimage, that you're drawn to this way of life? How do you relate to the whole concept? How's it all landing in you? And as you look back over your life, do you get a sense of that thread? I love how Nicholas called it the golden thread. Your golden thread. What's the through line in your life? I think often some people get that sense of the thread from something in their childhood. I know I did. That sense of a kind of effervescence or joy, something that made you feel alive and free, perhaps in your childhood. Or maybe it came to you later in life that you came across it. But just this sense of inner aliveness, of agency, maybe that sense of calling, the sense of how the divine manifests through you, through your life. Have you experienced that sense of the sweet spot? I think that can so show us perhaps what that is, what our particular through-line thread is. Where do you find traction in your life? That sense of agency that has nothing to do with achieving or doing anything, and has everything to do with a fullness of being, our God-given nature, an abundance of heart. And then just to think of that equanimity, the balance that Nicholas was talking about. How flexible do you feel? Like balance and flexibility go together. How able are you to balance conflicting needs and goals, duties, responsibilities? Are you willing to fall down and get up? Life is just endlessly falling down and getting up, letting go, surrendering, engaging with risk and responsibility and possibility. Is there anything in your life that this morning you could attend to more carefully, more heartfully, with more reverence and attention? Is there anything in your life that feels like that base metal? I love this analogy, this base metal of our lives, and somehow to allow that to alchemize into gold. What's difficult in your life that you could be alchemizing and turning into love? And finally, just to bring to your mind that image that Nicholas mentioned of a beautiful piece of tapestry or a garment, a seamless garment, where each one of us, in finding our thread, weaving that thread together, what kind of garment are we creating in our families, in our communities, here at the chapel? Just consider, just imagine what that garment looks like. I just remember my mum always talking about life being like a beautiful piece of tapestry, that we just see the scraggly bits underneath, but the other side is this beautiful, just this beautiful creation, and that's what really God sees, kind of thing. So what are we weaving together? And that being the kingdom of heaven.